Good evening, this is Gary Emmett broadcasting live with Dale Wetzel from Peacock Alley. As you know, Dale, this is Teeny Tuesday. Martini Tuesday is 2 for 1. And I suspect this group of guests are different than the other group we had that is much younger. I'm not sure they're martini drinkers, but I don't know if there's any of these guys that are martini drinkers here, but you and I were talking about it. I said I'll drink a little beer or wine, and I'm not much help when we come to talk about martinis 2 for 1 tonight.
Well, I prefer shaken, not stirred, just like James Bond. I prefer gin instead of vodka. So there you have it.
Any of our guests know anything about martinis at all? Anybody look here? They're all looking blank.
I didn't say I knew anything about them. I just said that those were my preferences.
So, by the way, at Peacock Alley, 2 for 1 martinis tonight and $2 off on appetizers till 10 o'clock. So if you're out and about, it's going to be pretty cold the next few nights, and I noticed there's plenty of people out this evening. So, Dale, as we transition to what went on in the legislature today, why don't you give us a little snapshot of what went on up at the Hill today?
You said we were broadcasting live. With me, it's like semi-live. Okay. There were a number of interesting things in the legislature today, which there always is because it's a compressed session. There's always, half a dozen to a dozen things going on that, frankly, would make the front page of any newspaper in North Dakota if you had time to get to it all. There were a couple of bills to increase taxes, which might come as a shock to folks who think that they think correctly that North Dakota has a rather substantial budget surplus. One of the bills to increase taxes would set a flat corporate income tax rate of 4.67%. Right now there are 3 brackets for corporate income. They range from 1.68% to 5.15%. The 5.15% applies to more than $50,000 of income. There are 2 lower rates that apply to less income. And what this bill would do is institute a flat tax rate of 4.67%, which would reduce the tax rate for the highest bracket of corporate income and raise the tax rate for the lower 2. The other tax increase bill is a bill to raise the cigarette tax. It would raise a North Dakota cigarette tax from 44 cents a pack to $1 a pack. This would still leave North Dakota quite a ways behind the national average in terms of what is considered a reasonable cigarette tax rate. And also, the rates in our neighboring states are all much higher. Minnesota is about $1.23. South Dakota is $1.53. Montana is $1.70. North Dakota ranks 46th in the nation when it comes to the size of the cigarette tax, and it has not been raised since 1993. There was a bill that would prohibit employers from asking for personal information on social networking sites, such as your username and your password, so that they could access your private information on a social networking site, your messages, other items other information that you might deem private. And we had a group of gentlemen on earlier in the evening to talk about that. There's also a group of abortion bills in the Senate Judiciary Committee. What they all have in common is that they seek to define life at the moment of conception, and the fertilized egg, so to speak, would have the same panoply of human rights that are granted to living, breathing human beings. And that will be a very interesting debate. That's something that the legislature is accustomed to. We have this debate every 2 years as to when life begins and when abortion should be regulated. There's also a proposal to make it a Class C felony if you are an adult, 21 years old or older. If you decide to buy alcohol for someone who's underage, right now it's a Class A misdemeanor to do that, which has a punishment of a year in jail and $2,000 fine. This bill would make it a Class C felony for someone who is 21 years old or older to procure alcohol and give it to someone who's underage. A Class C felony is 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. That's, I don't want to take up too much of our sponsors' time, Gary, so I guess I'll cut that off right now.
Well, you got a bunch of special guests here this evening. This hour is brought to you by the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. So, Robbie, thanks for being with us this evening. And Dale, take it away and introduce our guest, and let's have a good segment here talking about the issues that are important to North Dakota.
We have Mr. Robbie Thompson, who's the president and CEO of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. We have Mr. Greg Tschider, who is the attorney for the organization. And we have Mr. Don Vigesaa, who is a Republican state representative from Cooperstown, and he is the assistant Republican majority leader in the North Dakota House. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Dale. Glad to be here.
I understand that there's a recent federal appeals court case that really has you all jazzed up, and let's talk about that to start with.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. Well, we've had an interesting last probably 10 days or so. Within the last 10 days, we've had over 3,500 pages of new regulations that have been issued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that regulate financial institutions with regards to mortgage lending. All of these provisions were required to be issued by the 21st of January by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They were required under the Dodd-Frank Act, and for those that haven't heard, Dodd-Frank, federal law that about 2 years ago, 2010, was enacted, and there's a short read. It's a nice 836-page law, and it has a lot of provisions in there with regards to financial institutions. Really, purpose was to address the financial crisis. And one of the things they did was they created a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that transferred the regulatory authority from 7 different agencies into the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It also allowed for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to promulgate rules on the consumer disclosures on loans, electronic products, 21 different or 18 different regulations. We refer to it as the alphabet soup, the Reg A, Reg B, Reg C, those types of things that were all transferred over to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But they couldn't do that until they actually had a director in place. They couldn't promulgate the rules on new rules until they had a director in place. And for about a 6-month period of time, they didn't have a director, so they didn't have some authority. The Treasury Department was fighting against the consumer groups in some respects, and there was different opinions about whether the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had regulatory authority over certain things that they could do. And ultimately, the president tried to get a appointee, have someone confirmed by the Senate. And the Republicans can block that, and were threatening to filibuster if they were going to ever try to bring this person for confirmation. And so the president made the decision to appoint the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as well as 3 members of the National Labor Relations Board, to their respective committees during a recess period.
And who is this director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
The director is Richard Cordray, and he was the Attorney General for the state of Ohio previously. Originally, the thought was that Elizabeth Warren, who's now a senator from Massachusetts, was going to run this agency, but they felt they could never get her confirmed and have her get in there, so she just went ahead and ran for the Senate, I guess. So.
Well, anyway, you were talking about how there was a recess appointment made to get Mr. Cordray into his job.
Correct, and they made that. The president made that recess appointment, and it was quite a stir. During that time, the Senate claimed that they were still in session, and they had somebody come in, and basically one lucky senator got to come there every 3 days, gavel, and leave after 3 minutes. But they claimed that they never were out of session. That's the argument that they made. The president's argument that the session wasn't in recess, and as a result, he had the right to make the appointment. Well, just this week, after all these rules were issued, the Court of Appeals, 3-panel Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, ruled that the president's appointments were unconstitutional to the National Labor Relations Board. And there's a case that is moving through the system that actually would be a national labor that would affect the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But the logic is that same day, same appointments. So the CFPB's director isn't actually there, so the National Labor Relations Board person and the CFPB both should not be allowed.
And what impact would this have on the 3,500 pages of regulations that you mentioned?
That's a great question, and we're not sure right now at this point in time. The way that the law reads in Dodd-Frank is that if the CFPB doesn't issue regulations by January 21st, the law actually takes place. So right now, when we're doing mortgages and in doing financial services related to real estate loans, question is, should we be acting under the Dodd-Frank law that's actually in the law, or should we be looking at the regulations that are going to be taking effect? And unfortunately, what that creates is just uncertainty. And nothing's worse in the financial services industry than uncertainty. You want to have clear rules, clear regulations, and right now we have a lot of uncertainty.
Mr. Tschider, could you tell us, could you kind of try to summarize for us what the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in the case that Mr. Thompson was talking about? As I understand it, they ruled in this National Labor Relations Board case essentially that the Senate was not in recess, so where the President could not make recess appointments because the Senate wasn't in recess.
Well, the Constitution is very specific, and it says that if the President only has the authority if the Senate is not in the recess. The Senate has recesses going on all year long. And the way the Constitution is written, it seems to imply singular as opposed to plural. So issue number one is what recess is really being referred to. Is it the one in August? Was it the one in December? Which one is going to be? The Circuit Court of Appeals simply said, listen, the Senate was not in recess. Therefore, automatically you have violated the Constitution and your appointment is not proper. And because these appointments were not proper, all these regulations that were promulgated are void. So we are sitting with a situation where we really don't know. The big problem that we've had with Congress, with the activism that we have seen, is that the pages of regulations are monumental. As of last year, before these latest regs came in, we had about 10,000 new pages of regulations. Wow. And to try to stay on top of this is almost impossible. They are flooding us with stuff. And then one of the other frustrating things is because they were acting so quickly on a lot of these acts, like the Credit Card Act, the Federal Trade Commission initially was supposed to be responsible for preparing regulations. Well, the law was going into effect August 1. July 15th, we still didn't have regulations. We didn't know what we were doing. Worse yet, I had a serious controversy between the software providers and the various credit unions. I had an opinion as to how this should run. Software providers basically said I really didn't know what I was talking about. So I called the Federal Trade Commission to find out what their opinion was going to be. Well, trying to find someone who would take responsibility for an opinion, well, you might as well beat your head against the wall. Finally, I talked to someone, and she said, no, we're not going to have regulations out by August 1. And I says, well, there's this ambiguity. How do we run? Well, I don't know. I said, well, what happens if I choose A and the FTC later on says, no, it's B? And she says, well, we'll just fine you.
Yeah,
well,
that's wonderful.
You know, that really makes you feel good. And if you're an attorney, you quickly check your legal malpractice policy just to see if you've got coverage. But the regulations have just they've inundated our industry. And if you have closed on a real estate loan recently, the pages of material, I mean, we're not talking pages, we're talking inches of paper. And the ironical thing is that this was set up to protect the consumer. Nobody reads this stuff. We have pages and pages and pages and pages of disclosures. Well, the average consumer, including the average attorney, doesn't read this stuff because it's too much. People want their loan. They know what their payments are going to be. They know what the interest rates are going to be. And that's really all they're concerned about. But we've become so overzealous about protecting consumers that I don't think we're protecting them.
These 3,500 pages of regulations that were referenced earlier, what can you tell us what do they do? Can you try to tell us about what some of them do?
Well, I mean, a lot of them.
What is their purpose?
A lot of them are disclosures and just require additional disclosures. And it's not that one rule. It's the complexity of one rule on top of another on top of another. And a lot of them were supposed to fix the mortgage crisis issues. And I think that when the CFPB first was announced as credit unions, as consumer-friendly institutions, we had cautious optimism that they were going to, and one of their mandates was to simplify the requirements. I mean, we'd love to give crystal clear disclosures to our consumers, but we can't because we have to give the disclosures that are required by the law, which is the 100 pages that Greg talks about with regards to a mortgage loan. I think that we hope that the CFPB would make it simpler and easier for consumers to understand, because today, I mean, if you went into a mortgage, if you sit there and read everything, that mortgage closer is they're gonna stab you with a pen, because they're so frustrated by how long it's taken. So people just sign it and go through, and that's not good for consumers. We would like them to really understand the terms of their agreement, but they can't because of all the different mortgage regulations, and that really was. The CFPB was put in a difficult spot because they had to issue all of those regulations in a short period of time, and if they didn't, the law would have taken effect without regulations. And so they've kind of been a little bit behind the curve there in terms of what they had to do. We hope that now they turn their attention to regulating non-financial institutions, which they have the authority to do, non-regulated financial institutions, payday lenders, etc.
I wanted to speak to Representative Vigesaa about any sort of issues that credit unions may have in the North Dakota Legislature this year, and also what is your opinion of all of this stuff that we've been talking about?
Well, Dale, it makes me awfully glad I'm a legislator in the state of North Dakota instead of the federal level, because one of the things that I think we try to do as a legislature in our state is not to over-regulate our citizens. And you can hear from these gentlemen that I think at the federal level there's just over-regulation. So I know that's one of our principles that we try to adhere to, is to not to over-regulate. And, I get, as an auto dealer, I get some of this a little bit on the edge too, about having to provide privacy notices to the people that buy cars and things like that. So I understand that even a dealership like ours in North Dakota gets inundated with a lot of federal regulations when it comes to lending and disclosures and things like that.
I was going to ask you about that. Has any of the work of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau filtered down to you as a car dealer in Cooperstown, North Dakota?
Well, I know that the NADA, our national association, lobbied very hard for dealerships to be exempted from these types of regulations because, we do lending, or we offer lending on our vehicles, and so we were kind of brought in to the whole realm of the consumer protection. But we have such a small little portion of that we tried to get out of most of the regulations. But we do have to issue privacy notices, just like you get from your credit card companies and your banks. Auto dealers have to do that too. And we end up dealing with a lot of it ourselves.
Does it take longer now to close a loan on a car than it did before?
Dale, I don't think it does necessarily, but we do have to disclose, and we have to provide those annual privacy notices. And anybody that we've got a business relationship, whether it be sales or service, we have to disclose that annually, and that's an extra layer of regulation that we didn't have before.
With that annual privacy notice, we had tried during the last legislative session, and the auto dealers did work with the credit unions and other institutions to try to make it so that we would only have to give those disclosures if it changes. Right now, if you give it, if it stays the exact same, your privacy policy year after year after year, you still have to send out a new notice. And we know, I'm guessing we could walk around this bar and ask somebody if they've ever read their privacy notice, and I'd be shocked unless it's the drunk guy in the corner that says yes.
Representative Vigesaa, let's put you on the spot. Have you ever read a privacy notice?
Yes, I have. When I was putting mine together for my dealership.
Okay. And what did it say?
Well, Dale, there is kind of the standard privacy notice. You get them in your credit cards, you get them from your banks, and they're kind of in a similar format. So the National Auto Dealer Association did allow us, there is a template that you can go on and just kind of fill in the blanks. And so I did read them. because I went through several to make sure that ours was similar and that it met the requirements.
I guess the reason I asked is there is a kind of a sameness to these. I mean, I get a lot of these.
Yes,
and
they're the same.
And there's, well, we collect information. This is why we collect it. This is what we do with it.
Yeah.
It's
yeah, they're all very similar, and ours mirrors many of the others that people get every day.
And they make sense. I mean, it is good to tell people how you share information. It's just the length of them and the complexity of them is too much to where the consumers aren't reading it. And that's just not good consumer protection regulation to just make a really long, complicated disclosure.
And not only that, it's very small print. I mean, people look at this stuff and they say, not a chance. And they find the garbage can right away.
Well, that's fact.
Or the recycling bin.
Yeah, and I had a lady once that wanted to read the back of our retail sales order. It's got all that fine print on the back.
Oh, my goodness.
And she was going to read that. She got about maybe one paragraph in, and I guess it's okay. And she signed the deal.
Mr. Tschider, what happens now to this court case that we were talking about earlier?
The administration has decided to appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court will probably take it, and then we'll see what's going to happen. The trouble is this doesn't happen overnight. I mean, they're not going to hear this case tomorrow. If they hear it next fall, I'd be amazed. And so we're going to have this window of really not knowing where we're at. And so that's going to make life difficult.
Is this going to inhibit the behavior of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
I don't think so. I think they're going to act standard, business as usual. They believe that it was a valid appointment and really don't really have much of a choice. Most of the laws that they've had to issue are all ones they're required to do so.
We're speaking this evening with Mr. Robbie Thompson. He's the president and CEO of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. Also, we're speaking with Greg Tschider. He's an attorney in Bismarck, and he's a lawyer for the association. We're also speaking to Mr. Don Vigesaa, a state representative from Cooperstown, North Dakota, a Republican, and the assistant Republican majority leader in the North Dakota legislature.
This is the legislature today, broadcasting live from Peacock Alley. Our sponsor is the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you after the break. Good evening. Welcome back to Peacock Alley. We're broadcasting live, and with your host, this is Gary Emneth, your host, Dale Wetzel. We've had a good early half hour talking with our sponsor, the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas, talking about a lot of the regulations and some things that are being overbearing to the banking industry as a whole. In fact, Dale, earlier I was thinking I have a friend in a small bank I was with earlier this year, and he's thinking of retiring. He just said the regulations are too overbearing. I mean, to the point that he almost put his head in his hand and said, I can't take this anymore. I mean, that's how intense this has gotten. I got another friend in Dallas who had started a small bank a few years ago, and literally they've shut it down. They just gave up on it and said it's not going to work because of the pressures from the feds. It's just too much.
Well, one of the big problems is that small institutions, I don't care if you're talking about the small credit union or small bank, cannot cope with all of this. They can't stay on top of the regs. And, when we had the fiscal problem, we talked about large banks being too big to fail. And so all of a sudden, you expected that is the goal, to get control of that. Well, in fact, now those banks are substantially bigger than they were before.
Yeah,
well,
right.
If they were too big to fail in 2008, they're really too big to fail in 2013. What they're doing is they're making the institutions larger with this. And that is contrary to kind of what you expected the policy would be out of Congress to supposedly prevent the future problems. And so what we're having is the small financial institutions are forced to merge because they can't provide the services. So they have to merge with other institutions, and so they just keep getting bigger. And the unfortunate thing is we lose the little guy.
So they're basically, the reason these large banks are getting larger, if I understand your analysis, is that they need to be larger to deal with the increased regulatory demands. And
the problem is with the big banks, the reason they're larger is because the Treasury basically forced them to take on other entities. Plus, they were permitted to expand into other services and buy brokerage houses and all that kind of stuff, which was not permitted under Glass-Steagall.
We're talking this evening with Robbie Thompson, who is the president and CEO of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas, Mr. Greg Tschider, whose name Tschider, whose name you just heard, and his voice you just heard. He is a lawyer for the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas in Bismarck. And we have, as a new guest on our group, we have Mr. Marv Nelson, a Democrat from Rolette. Am I correct here?
Oh, it's Rolette County.
Rolette County,
I
yes.
live at Rolla.
Rolla, yes. And Mr. Nelson, I understand you wanted to speak about a bill in the legislature that allows the Bank of North Dakota to make home mortgage loans.
Yeah.
And how do you think that this ties into what we've been talking about?
Well, it's North Dakota has some unique ability to respond to federal regulation through the fact that we have this rather unique bank, and it functions as a central bank for us. And last session we had a small pilot project we had to fight for quite a bit to allow the state bank to really provide the expertise and the paperwork for small banks to do home mortgages. And it's gotten to be a problem. Small banks, credit unions and stuff, it's complicated enough that it's hard for them to maintain the expertise on staff to do just a small number of mortgages each year. So the idea was let's use our central bank, let's use the expertise, let's do it efficiently, let's have someone at the state bank do this, and then have those banks and those small credit unions be able to continue to serve the people of North Dakota like they have. And it's on the Senate side this time, basically getting away from it being a small pilot project to an expansion, and also include credit unions now with the banks.
And do you think that this is a good idea? This is good legislation?
Yeah, I'm socialist enough. It doesn't bother me a little bit to use the state bank to benefit all of North Dakota. I mean, we still have a lot of towns where the larger regional banks, we'd call them, or national banks, are literally just not interested in doing business, and it comes down to a small bank or a credit union is the banking institution for that town. And to try and minimize the effect of regulation on them, it only makes sense to me to use the state bank.
How does this make it easier for a person in a rural community to get a mortgage loan?
Well, otherwise, in some communities, it was basically impossible. So I guess anything is easier than nothing. The thing is that under Dodd-Frank, they have to fill out the paperwork properly, get it all done, and it takes some expertise. And if you're a credit union, you're doing 4 or 5 mortgages a year, you just can't justify keeping developing and keeping the expertise on staff. So this allows you to go to the Bank of North Dakota where there'll be the expertise and such, and you can get that mortgage for that homeowner done and get it done in a way that meets the regulations.
Mr. Thompson, does the association have a position on this legislation?
Well, we've supported it and asked that credit unions be included in it, so we're grateful that credit unions are included in there. It's amazing how many times I get calls from all around the country from people wondering about this state bank that people talk about and asking us questions about it all the time. So I think that anything that can help the housing crisis that we have here in North Dakota, we'd support.
Mr. Tschider, could you tell us a bit about what is it that credit unions and banks generally, or smaller banks in particular, have to do to make home mortgage loans that they didn't have to do 5 or 6 years ago, and how is the job more complicated and more difficult?
Well, as we discussed in the first half hour, obviously the regulations are much more difficult, much more demanding. The other problem is that to make a mortgage, you have to have paperwork that also supports the loan, which means that you need an appraiser to come in and do a valid appraisal on the property. And the requirements there are much more stringent. It used to be that a loan officer could accept an application, call the appraiser and say, will you do an appraiser on this house in Beulah? And the appraiser would say yes or no, and I'll have it done by such and such a time, and the fee will be this. Under the new rules, the loan officer can't contact the appraiser. What has to happen is you have to have someone else within the organization who is independent from the loan department that gets to determine who the appraiser is going to be. And you're supposed to have a pool of appraisers so that you're not using the same one all the time. Well, that's difficult in the major urban areas. In the rural areas, it's next to impossible. And
because there aren't that many appraisers, right?
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And they're in big demand. And so you have this these ridiculous regulations. It's even to the point where if the appraiser doesn't get their job done, the loan officer still can't call the appraiser and say, "Where's my appraisal?" You have to go through this other party. Well, think about the small banks and the small credit unions. They don't have a staff large enough to assign these different responsibilities. And it gets very, very difficult. Rural lending is difficult at best because when you're an appraiser, you're supposed to come up with comparable sales. Well, that's very difficult in the smaller communities, especially with commercial property. And so, the mortgage lending, they've just made it much more difficult to jump through all the hoops to give these people the loans they should get.
The method that you mentioned about how it has to be done now, that the loan officer can't contact the appraiser directly, they have to farm that job out to someone else. Why was that done? What was the logic of it?
Well, the logic with that was going back to 06 and 07 when all these crazy loans were being made. There seemed to have been loan officers and appraisers in cahoots, and so the loan officer would call their friend Harry and say, "I need an appraisal for $200,000," and the property was only worth $150,000, and so Harry would do the appraisal at $200,000. It'd be put in there, and they'd package the loan and ship it out. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things people don't realize is that financial institutions, regulated financial institutions, got blamed for a lot of these lousy loans, and a lot of it was unregulated mortgage people. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could open a shop basically on your own and start making loans, and then pull them up, and then sell them to some poor sucker based on the paperwork.
Yeah, and many small banks and credit unions, they don't sell a lot of their loans. They hold them in their own portfolio, which means it's important that they maintain a positive relationship with those individuals and all the people in their community. So they have to do it right to be able to stay in business. If you're a really large bank, you make a loan, you sell it to somebody else. Some of them, they don't care about their continued relationship. Where that's not the model that we operate under.
Was there any sort of effort made to? I'm sure there was, but was there any sort of effort made to exempt smaller institutions from these requirements, and also not to have these kinds of requirements if the credit union was going to keep the loan itself rather than sell it to someone else?
Well, actually, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the last rulemaking on what we refer to as the ability to pay, or the qualified mortgage rule, which essentially is a lot of the underwriting standards that credit unions have had for a long period of time. There's a lot of other nuances in that rule, but we give those kind of loans. We've been doing that standard and be operating in that way for a long time anyway. So it really hasn't been a burden. But in that process, they did issue a rulemaking saying that credit unions are the type of institutions that they want to protect, that they want to see continue, that they think is a good business model. And because they do portfolio their loans, where they've issued a proposed rule, to request for comments on whether or not we should exempt credit unions and small community institutions that are portfolio lenders. So I think we're fortunate that we actually seen that. It's one of the actions the CFPB has done recently that makes us feel like our messaging is getting through to them, that we are different, that we are doing it right out here. There also was some exemptions in that rule with regards to rural institutions and the way that some of the rural loans are done, especially with regards to balloon loans, where rural loans are really, you need those balloon loans in a rural community.
How these, we mentioned earlier that the big are getting bigger, and part of the reason is that these regulations that are coming forth in a torrent, you need a larger bank bureaucracy, if I could use the term, to deal with that. Are these regulations essentially forcing the consolidation of the credit union industry in North and South Dakota?
Well, that's certainly an impact. I think that when we talk to credit unions that have decided to merge, the primary reasons why are either you have a retiring CEO of a very small institution that's been there for many, many years and know the ins and outs, and when they go to look for somebody else, they run into a little sticker shock. that would be one reason. The second reason is that we hear, and the most common reason is we just can't continue to comply with all of the regulations. It's too expensive for us to hire people. We got to order forms every time we do something. I mean, when you make a change to a form, it's not as simple as changing it on a form. You got to change your data systems. You got to order new forms. There's an expense that goes along with that, and that creating that uncertainty, and it creates a little bit of a scary environment for a financial institution when you're not quite sure what we want to do. We want to do the right thing. We want to give loans. We want to give clear disclosures. And we probably could give clearer disclosures if we weren't limited by some of the regulations.
Representative Nelson, what's the solution to all of this? You look like you're an intelligent man. Why don't you just tell us?
Well, I can't wait to hear this.
Tell us the
Pressure's on. Pressure's on.
Yeah, here we go. Well, some of the federal things, sometimes I kind of almost just put them aside because it's like I don't feel I can necessarily do a whole lot there. So we try to pick around the edges and do things on the state level. And we're finding, it's amazing how all these things you start out and you say, gee, we can't see a way through it. And then you get a lot of people together and they start talking and looking and stuff. And there's almost always a path through. It just takes time sometimes. So, really dialogue and like I say, having the state bank within the state of North Dakota really gives us some advantages that others do. And then, just the situation in North Dakota with the economy, with the growth and stuff, it starts out making things worse for us in some ways because when the regulations hit, a lot of appraisers left the industry. And so there's a shortage in the nation, but we have a shortage of appraisers right at a time when we're having explosive growth. And so if we had the same number as before, we'd be short. So we're really short. So that causes problems for us now. But, there's ways through this. I'm not a big fan of some regulation. I mean, certainly, if an financial institution is keeping a loan and taking the risk long term, most of these regulations become moot because they're not going to put themselves at risk. We're talking the secondary market and such, and so there really does need to be some reasonable exemptions to the regulations. Is really where it needs to be.
Why did appraisers leave the business?
Well, a lot of them were just fairly old, and they didn't want to deal with the new regulations. I
was thinking I should go into the appraisal business after listening to you gentlemen.
We need more, so we'd love to see you go over there. Yeah.
Yeah, you got a few years?
Yeah, I am. Hopefully more than one. More than one or two. You mentioned on the state. What can be done on the state level to encourage to help credit unions, rural institutions? Is there anything that can be done that isn't currently being done?
Well, I guess just the fact of the program I mentioned with the state bank right now. I mean, if we don't pass that bill, that isn't being done. They've got to have that bill. And in general, I think that's really where we got to turn for a lot of this expertise and such is to our state bank in order to provide it in an efficient model. I mean, you can't get to a point where you're throwing $20,000 worth of extras on a mortgage and get it to work. You've got to get to do it in an efficient manner, and that's where we've got to go to be able to help these small banks and credit unions do it in an efficient manner and keep the costs down to the consumer.
We're speaking to Representative Marv Nelson, whose voice you just heard. He's a Democrat from Rolla, representing District 9, Rowlett County, and the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Reservation. We are speaking also to Mr. Robbie Thompson, the President and CEO of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas, and Greg Tschider, who is a Bismarck attorney who represents the association. Representative Nelson, are you a credit union member?
Yeah, I guess it kind of almost seems like an automatic part of growing up in North Dakota is you got a credit union account someplace, and we've had some movements in our area. The one that was actually in Rolla closed, but we still have in Bisbee, which has a branch in St. John in my county, and growing up there's Maddock one in Rugby. I grew up in Rugby, and yeah, there.
Why did you choose to do business with a credit union instead of a bank? Well,
because we wear the white hats.
It's the personal touch, I guess a little bit. It's traditionally been a little more informal than a lot of banks would be. You get things, the old standard of the debt dying with the debtor is a benefit to a lot of people. And you're basically working in co-op with a bunch of other people for the mutual good. You know, I'm not to the point where I get to sit on many bank boards, but you can certainly have your input at the credit union meeting.
Was that a point of attractiveness to you, that you're dealing with a community-owned institution and the people on the board are people that you know them, or you know where they live? Certainly,
that is.
Mr. Thompson, is this part of the appeal of credit unions generally in this, you know, essentially we have this image of large banks, you know, jacking you around with fees and whatnot, and is that a market niche that you can exploit? You know, we're small, we're smaller, we're community owned, our board members are people that you know. Is that a market niche that can be exploited?
Well, absolutely. I think that the credit unions, you know, all of their decisions are made locally, so they're not shipped off to San Francisco or New York to make a decision on whether to give a loan. Here in in Rugby, North Dakota, we make the decision here in Rugby. That certainly is an advantage that we have. The community idea that credit unions are cooperatives. They are owned by their own members. The members have a voice, they have a vote, and they have a chance to be even on the board of directors is very attractive to a lot of people, to be part of that group of people that work together for the mutual benefit of all of them. And I would say that in the last year and a half, after what we referred to as Bank Transfer Day, we had about somewhere between 3 and 6 million people that changed from a national bank to a credit union. And we think that we'd like to see them continue to do that. We know that we're the best financial institution for the average North Dakotan, and I think that proves that part.
Can you explain what is Bank Transfer Day?
It was you're a big Facebook user, right, Dale?
Oh, absolutely.
All the time he's on there. So I'm trying to keep him off a little bit. It's getting to be taking up too much of his workday.
It was a big social media campaign launched by one woman, a 26-year-old, 25-year-old woman in California who got mad at their bank after they raised her fee on the ATM cards. And she started this internet thing about change your bank on November 5th of last year, or of 2011. And that day, hundreds of thousands of people, after they went onto her Facebook page, went on and closed their accounts at their banks and went to a credit union. And then it just kept continuing and snowballing on until 3 to 4 million people actually changed to a credit union.
So this was not something that was ginned up by the credit union industry.
We had absolutely nothing to do with it. We certainly, after that, talked about it and seen the advantages. But this was one person's their own power of social media.
Is it something that you intend to pursue in the future? Maybe make it an industry recruiting tool?
Well, I think that someone's trademarked every day is a good day for Bank Transfer Day. So I think we'll be using something like that in the future. But it is about the fact that when you go to a small or rural or community credit union, you get treated the right way as opposed to when you're at a big national bank where you're just a number.
It is probably significant that you don't find websites with their entire dedication being to hating a credit union, whereas many of the national banks do have entire websites dedicated just to people who hate them.
Not only websites, but other organizations too, I think. We've been speaking this evening with Representative Marv Nelson, whose voice you just heard. He's a Democrat from Rolla. He is a credit union member, and we've been talking to him about legislation that affects credit unions. We've been talking to Mr. Robbie Thompson, who's the president and CEO of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. And we've talking to Mr. Greg Tschider of Bismarck, an attorney for the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. Mr. Tschider, how long have you been representing credit unions?
Since 1972.
And how did you get into it?
That was your elementary school that you started that in, right?
I was really young. I was only 13 when I had my first credit union client. It was a friend who knew a president at the local credit union, and they needed a new attorney, and somebody recommended me, and that's how I got started. And then the Credit Union Association moved from Jamestown to Bismarck, and I was lucky enough to get at the account.
What appeals to you about representing credit unions?
The people. The credit unions are a complete co-op volunteer system. The board of directors don't get paid. They volunteer their time. They are concerned about their people. The profit motive is not the first motive. It's, they have the catchphrase, people helping people. In fact, that is reality. They're concerned about their members. They take care of their members. And the members own the place, and they're proud of it.
Sounds like an excellent recruiting speech for the next bank transfer day, Mr. Thompson.
That does. Good job, Greg. Appreciate that. It's like you've been doing it for a few years.
Greg, I wonder, do you have a Facebook page for these guys, or do you Twitter or Facebook? Or?
I don't Twitter or Facebook. I remember somebody emailing me one day and asking me if I would be their friend. And I thought, Mr. Rogers has died. And
he took his sweater with him, too.
This is Gary Emineth and Dale Wetzel broadcasting live from Peacock Alley. There's still an hour left before Teeny Tuesday all ends up. $2 off on appetizers and martinis 2 for $1. I almost forgot what that was there, Dale. So.
Isn't it more than an hour? I mean, it's only coming up at 9 o'clock.
10 o'clock is when the cutoff is. Some of them are till 11, but tonight's till 10 o'clock.
Well, maybe if we go up and beg the bartenders, they'll extend it for us.
But we can hurry maybe before the show's over. So thanks for joining us tonight. Look forward to talking to you again tomorrow night. The Legislature today from 7 to 9 at KFYR 550 AM.